What a lot of people don't realize is that one of the greatest wealth transportation is happening right now, right under our nose. And most people don't even know what's going on. And most people certainly will not be able to take advantage out of it. And the problem is that people just simply don't know that it's happening right there. So what we will do in this video is that we're first going to try to understand what exactly that wealth transformation and how to take advantage out of it. And in order for us to have a much clearer and a much better understanding how to actually take a real advantage and take our piece of the pie, is that we have to understand how that wealth in the first place was created. Because if we kind of can figure out the source of that wealth and how it kind of evolved and what exactly it's going, we might actually position ourselves in such a way that we will take advantage out of it. So please be patient, because I'm going to go through some of the things in order to explain to you the basics. And by the end of the video, we will actually learn how to take advantage out of that. So right now, there are around $70 trillion that are about to change hands in the United States. And now some people put this number at $90 trillion. Some people put it at $60 trillion. So this is basically the average. And $70 trillion, frankly speaking, is a lot of money. Even the wealthiest people in the country don't have that much money. I mean, if you check even not 1% of this amount, but literally a tiny percentage, like 0.1, no, I'm talking about 0.00001% of that money. That will already amount to millions of dollars. Now, in order to understand how we ended up in such a situation, is that we have to go slightly back in history. Now, if you take a look at the history of humanity for the last few hundred years, you will realize that most of the wealth was concentrated in Europe, like back in 18th to 19th century, because we had a few European empires that took over the world. I mean, think of Great Britain that colonized India and even the United States. Think of Spain that took over most of the South America. Think of, I mean, Germany wasn't really the empire that took over the world, but if you go back to the late 19th century and beginning 20th century, it was one of the most powerful countries out there. Think of France that still controls some of the parts of Africa. So what happened by 20th century is that a lot of the global wealth from all across the globe concentrated in Europe, and then these countries suddenly, or these empires I would call them, suddenly tried to wage a war against each other. And in the process of trying to destroy each other, you know, war is not cheap. You need to build your logistics, you need to feed your army, you need iron, you need aluminium, you need things just to build your weapons. And meanwhile, well, those European countries that concentrated the wealth over the last few centuries, they were using all of their resources, giving it to the United States in exchange for resources in order to win World War I and World War II. So what happened by 1945 is that most of that wealth that has been concentrated in Europe suddenly moved to the United States in a very short period of time. The first transition was in 1914 to 1918, and the second transition was from 1938 to 1945. So if you kind of look at the map of what actually happened, is that like suddenly overnight the United States found itself with 90% of all the wealth in the world in that country. Most of the gold was in the United States. And even if you go back, like back in the days, we did not have China, because China was actually suffering. They even call it a century of humiliation when China literally suffered. So after World War II, Japan is destroyed, China is suffering. I mean, the Soviet Union barely stands on its knees. Then we have Europe entirely demolished. What happened after that is that United States got in and set up its global world order that benefited US companies. And it's not because the United States is this greedy country that wanted everything for itself and colonized the entire world. And I'm not saying that the US is super generous, but if you look at it from a very factual perspective, you'll find out that the system that the United States built after 1945 was beneficial for everybody, because the rest of the world was destroyed. Most of the technology was in the United States. The US had the most advanced banking system back in the days, and it was very normal for the United States to set up a system that would benefit, first of all, the United States, and because it's globalized, it benefited the entire world, and the entire world started actually growing. And that's why back in the days, the average, just being in the United States was already a privilege, because that would make you automatically richer than the rest of the world. And that's why if you kind of pull out the numbers, you will find out that the average person back in the days, like the median income of the middle class, was 50% higher than it's today. So the average person back in the days, like back in 1950s and 60s and 70s, was 50% at least wealthier than that person is today. Because back in the day, that person had, for example, with an average job, he could afford a house, he could afford a proper health care, he could go to get education without getting into dozens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Today, if you must stick to your job, because if you actually get fired and you get sick, your healthcare bill is going to cost you your life. And by the time you are like 30 years old, you already have a student debt, you have a healthcare debt, you have a personal loan, you have a mortgage, and you have a list of other loans. And house prices are so expensive compared to the average salary that you're making that you barely can afford that house. So the average person today is significantly much less wealthier than the average American who was back in 1960s and 70s, simply because he's out of college, he's out of university, he is living in a country that literally controls the entire world, has the most advanced banking system. Like the rest of the world, if they wanted to do business internationally, they had to do it through the United States, because they couldn't use their currencies to trade with each other. If you want to trade, for example, like China wants to trade with Japan, or China wants to trade with India back in the days, they had to use the dollar. But you are in the US, you have the most advanced technology, you have the most advanced economy, you have the most advanced financial system, your currency is the most advanced financial currency in the world. So any business you start back in the days compared to the rest of the world would most likely be successful, just because you could ship that thing to the rest of the world. You can ship technology, you can ship things, whatever is produced in the United States. And that's how people basically got so wealthy in the United States. That's how wealth, first of all, came to the United States during the war, and then after the war, when the rest of the world was trying to get itself back together. So a lot of the most popular names that you hear, such as Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, and other businessmen, most of these people were born during the baby boomers period that lasted from 1946 to 1964. These people were born in the golden era of the United States, where they had all the opportunities in the world. And that's why those people started actually building businesses. They ended up becoming some of the wealthiest people in the world. And all you have to do is just take a look at Forbes list. You will realize these are the people, and these are some examples, because there are plenty of people who actually, for example, made a couple of billions of dollars. And you don't often see them on the list, but they are there. There are people who made hundreds of millions of dollars. You never see these people on the list because they are not the richest people in the world, but just having a net worth of $200 million, $300 million already makes you it just makes you one of the richest people on the face of the earth. So the US was ahead of everyone else, and it gave an opportunity in every industry, and US companies slowly started taking over the entire world. If you have ever been outside the United States, you know that US companies are all over the place. Like McDonald's exists in every single country in the world. Coca-Cola is the favorite soft drink in every country in the world. And these are just some examples, because if you take a look at a company like Apple today, the rest of the world uses iPhones and MacBooks and everything else. Just some examples. So US companies get out there because of this concentration of wealth, take over the entire world, and baby boomers end up becoming the richest people in the world. Then during the days, the United States was the center of innovation. Even, for example, in 1947, they built the first semiconductor. We have an entire war today happening between China and the rest of the world and the United States for these semiconductors. If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, it was clear that whoever is going to dominate the oil is going to dominate the century, because it was that commodity that will fuel the rest of the economy. You want your cars to actually kind of drive. You need oil. You need the planes to fly. You need oil. You need a lot of other things to work together. You need oil. You can even use oil in order to generate electricity. But now today, semiconductors fuel the modern economy. Every piece of technology you have, like the camera that's in front of me, like my MacBook, my iPad, my microphone, probably my phone, my Apple Watch, my car, like every piece of technology works with semiconductors. And the first semiconductor was built in the United States, and the US literally dominated this industry for the decades to come. Go back to 1967, for example, and then you have Boeing introducing Boeing 737. This plane became the most important plane in the commercial aviation because it became the most successful ever plane that has ever been built. And every airline across the globe wanted this plane. With this plane, transportation across the globe became much more feasible, it became much more affordable, and everybody just was ordering. And Boeing 737 did not have a competitor. Of course, later on, then Airbus was created by a number of European countries, but it was the only competitor, and it didn't come close back in the days to Boeing. And then we had, of course, internet was built in the United States that was called ARPANET. Of course, it wasn't the internet that we know it today because it was slightly different and it needed time for it to grow, but it was the first internet. And then 1972, Apple II was the first, it's not literally the first personal computer, but it was probably the most successful first personal computer that was developed. And all of that was happening in the United States. Now, just to give you a context that the rest of the world at this point was barely trying to do anything. And when I'm saying this, I'm not kind of exaggerating. And why it's important to understand this is because if you don't understand the situation, there is wealth in the world and wealth is created in the world. And if you don't understand the situation across the globe, you don't understand the privilege that the United States or the people who were born in the United States during that period. Like during this time when the United States was creating Boeing 737, when Apple was introducing the first personal computer, do you know what was happening in China during that time? There was something called the Great Famine, where 50 million people died of hunger. I'm not saying they're economically struggling. I'm not saying that the economy is not competing with the US back in the days. I'm saying that when 50 million people in your country die out of hunger, do you understand how bad the situation was during those days back in China? Now, Japan was also kind of recovering from its loss that it took back in 1945, but it kind of recovered itself closer like to 1970s. But if you go back to 1950s and 60s, Japan was merely a small economy that literally couldn't compete, not just with the United States, but with the rest of the world. And that's why what we had like the Soviet Union, and there were plenty of countries that were part of the Soviet Union. And commerce was illegal in Soviet Union. And of course, if you kind of put these two countries together, Soviet Union was kind of competing with the United States during Cold War. They sent the first man to space. They built some of the most innovative technologies out there. But the system was so ineffective that they stretched it to their maximum. At the end of the day, the entire union collapsed back in 1991, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Even go back to 1990s. Like most of the tech companies that you know were actually created and founded in the United States. Everything from Amazon to eBay to PayPal. And these are just some of the companies out there. LinkedIn, Google, Facebook. Now, it wasn't just 1990s. It was like 1990s and early 2000s when most of the tech companies were actually emerging. Technology or internet was spreading all across the globe, but it was the United States when that concentration of wealth actually was happening. Even the money from old industries, the wealth from previous industries was slowly moving into this new industry that is called the internet. And all those people, especially baby boomers, most of those companies were founded by baby boomers, the people who were born during let's say, the golden era of the United States, and they concentrated within their hands some of the largest wealth on the entire planet. I'm talking about the names that I mentioned previously, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. How much wealth is there in the United States as of the time I'm recording this video? Because if we know how much wealth is, then we can actually understand how much of that realistically is going to be passed to the next generation. And that's a good question to ask ourselves. Now, to understand that, I have to understand the world. So the United States represents 4% of the global population. Now, the population, for example, in a country like China, that is the second world's largest economy, is 5 times larger than the United States. The population of India is also like around 5 times larger than the United States. The population of the entire European Union is 2 or 3 times larger. I think it's 2 or 3 times larger than the United States. And United States represents a very tiny percentage of the global population. Now, that context is very important to understand how much wealth there in the United States. Now, when the US just represents a tiny percentage of the global population, 22 million millionaires in the world are in the United States. 22 million millionaires are in the United States. Now, the second country that comes on the list that has most of the millionaires is China, that has 6 million millionaires. China, that has 5 times the population of the United States, has just a fraction, just 6 million millionaires, while the United States, that has 5 times less people than China, has 22 million millionaires. And that just tells you how much wealth is there in the United States and how much wealth concentrated in this country. 40% of all the millionaires in the world are in the United States. So 4% of the population in the US, but 40% of all the millionaires from across the globe are in the United States. 40% of all the billionaires are in the United States. So basically all the rich people are in the United States. Like almost half of all the rich people in the US are in the United States. And they're not like for some weird reason in the United States. It's not just because they suddenly decided to fly to the United States and live in the United States. Now, there are such people. I'm not claiming that people don't come from across the globe to live in the US, but the biggest number or the biggest percentage of those people made their money in the United States because of the stock market, because of the companies they have founded, because of the startups that they have joined, because of the high-paying jobs that they got, because the United States has this position of actually concentrating within itself all that wealth. But what is important to understand here is this simple fact. It's not like just because so much wealth is concentrated in the United States does not mean that everybody in the United States is taking advantage out of it. Because the wealth inequality in the United States with each year is actually growing, where most people are getting poorer and like the top 1% or the richest people are getting wealthier. Because if you take a look at the numbers, like top 1% of the population owns 35% of all the wealth in the country. So just 1%, like you have the entire pyramid, they own more than a third of all the wealth that exists in the country. Now, the next 9% owns around 40% of the wealth. So you can say in simple words that the top 10% controls or has 75% of all the wealth in the country. So 75% of all the wealth is concentrated within the top 10%. And now the other or the bottom 90% simply has 25% of the wealth. So most of the people who are in the United States are not really as wealthy as the top 1%, not even close. Their wealth is very close to the rest of the world. So what you have is a country where people who have most of the wealth have concentrated in one place. So this is a small number or a small percentage of people, if you want to call them like that. So the total wealth in the United States is around $150 trillion. Some people put it 140, others up to 170, but the average is around $150 trillion. And $70 trillion of this money is going to be transferred for one reason or another, and or the reasons that we are going to explore right now. And this is exactly what you want to take advantage out of it. This is the money that you are looking into, and some of this money is going to pass to some people, and there are different strategies that people are actually taking in order to profit and take advantage out of this transformation. So, what is the main reason that is driving this wealth transformation in the first place? Like, why? What suddenly changed or happened that this $70 trillion or $80 trillion probably, or 85 to some, according to some estimates, is going to shift? Now, the single biggest difference or the single biggest reason is that the previous generation, or the baby boomers who actually hold most of this wealth, who lived through the golden era of the United States and concentrated within themselves this wealth, that founded the largest companies or invested at the right time. They purchased like these stocks at pennies on the dollar that today worth, a single stock that they purchased for $1 today worth like $500 or $1,000. This generation is about to pass away because they're getting old. Like somebody who was born, for example, in 1950, he's like in his mid-70s, some of them in their late 60s, and slowly with each year this generation is going to pass away, and there will, of course, that wealth has to go somewhere. And this is not, they won't just inherit that wealth. It's a bit more complicated because of the second reason. The world has changed today, and it's no longer the world that was back in 1950s and 60s. It's no longer the US being this most powerful nation in the world. The rest of the world, China, like back in 1960s and 70s, 50 million people died out of hunger, that call it the Great Famine in China. But China today is the second largest economy in the world. Soviet Union collapsed and Russia re-emerged, and according to what we see, it's kind of doing better than a lot of people expected. Europe has entirely recovered, and it's some of the European economies are the largest economies out there. Think of Germany, that is like third or fourth largest economy. The United Kingdom has been struggling the last 30 years. Nonetheless, it's still one of the largest economies. France, and you have plenty of other countries that you can actually take a look at as an example. Poland, that was part of the Soviet Union back in the days, has now emerged and is becoming a superpower in the center of Europe. So what exactly that money is going to? Now, first of all, the most important thing that you have to understand is that a lot of that wealth is leaving the United States, whether we want that or not, no matter who says what, for a simple reason that the rest of the world developed, and a lot of money, a lot of investments, a lot of businesses, a lot of rich people are simply moving outside the United States, because United States, for example, is not as safe as European countries. Like if you just take a look at the standard of living in a lot of European cities and you compare them to the standard of living in the United States, like it's obvious that simply the standard of living in those places are much higher. And that's why a lot of people simply leave, especially when a lot of people can make their money in the United States and just live outside the United States. And a lot of industries are developing outside the United States. Now, take for example cars. United States was one of the first countries that became a dominant player in the auto market. But then Japanese cars came in 1970s and 80s. And then today we have a big move is happening towards electrical cars. Even though that the United States is still a prominent player in the electrical cars, China is the largest producers of electrical cars. And millions of cars around the globe are being actually produced electrical, and they are being produced in China, and the United States is about to catch up. Now, the second way, or the second place where that money is going to, is that it is going to be inheritance, which means that the next generation is going to actually inherit that money, and you can't do anything about it. Because when a baby, some people today, there is like a trend where billionaires are claiming that they will spend that money before they pass away, they will give it to charity, they will try to do something great with it. But if we are going to be completely honest with each other, most of that money is going to be passed down to their kids, period. Now, you want that or you don't want that, that is most likely the case is going to happen. Now, I don't want to just call some names that this person is going to do that or not, but the vast majority of all those millionaires and billionaires will do that. They will pass down that money to the next generation. So you can't really profit directly from that. That will only create a bigger wealth inequality in the United States, because there was a huge boom in the birth rates back in 1960s and 70s because people could afford that. But then as time passed, the next generation and the following generation started giving less birth because the system entirely changed and it became much more expensive to raise kids, and simply life became much more expensive. And that's why birth rate in the United States, if you I don't have the chart here, but if you kind of pull out the chart of the birth rate in the US, you will see a very clear trend that is like from 1950s, it's literally just going down. So that wealth is going to be passed to a smaller group of people, which means that a smaller group of people is going to control a larger share of the economy, which means that the wealth inequality is only going to rise much bigger. That's the sad reality that is waiting for us. So 53% of the world's wealth is going to be, or of that wealth is going to be passed down to the next generation. Now, the next way to actually profit from it, and this is exactly what has been happening in America for the last couple of decades, over the last 2 decades mostly, is private equity. You've heard about it. Private equity is taking all over the place, and these are the people who are taking advantage out of this global wealth transformation that's happening not just in the United States, but primarily in the United States. Now, people might not know what is private equity, but private equity sounds very complicated. In reality, it's a very simple thing. What private equity does is that there are a financial company that are trying, they look, for example, first of all, what they do is that they go to investors and raise money from investors. They tell them, listen, I'm going to take your money and we will invest it much better. Now, they take money from investors, for example, and then they go and buy companies out there that are struggling. Not necessarily, these companies might not be struggling. These companies might just having some difficulties, for example. So they will take investors' money and they will go and buy this company in order to fix it and sell it for a higher price. Now, of course, this company is struggling and they can't really, for example, fix their problems. But because private equity, they have very great connections usually with financial institutions right here, what they will do is that they will convince them to loan this company billions of dollars in order to fix itself. So when it fixes itself, and then they will start selling this company to someone else, for example, to some kind of investor, or they will literally just divide the company into small pieces, and then they will just sell it, for example, piece by piece to different entities out there. Now, usually a lot of companies that private equity actually, not most of the companies, but a lot of companies, they end up as failures because they will have a lot of debts that has been borrowed by the banks through these connections that the private equities usually have. But private equity don't really matter, because when the money comes from investors, what do you think private equity do? They charge them very high fees. So private equity, at the end of the day, this financial institution is going to make their money anyways, because they're charging really high fees. So even if this company fails, even these investors don't really make that much money, who cares about the banks at the end of the day, because they are probably in the same game together. They will make their money anyways. So a lot of rich people, and in order to be part of the private equity, it's not, these people don't come to people like you, like people who are actually operating private equities. They don't come to you who have a few $1,000s or even like hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars. Now, if private equities usually go to the wealthiest people in the country, at least you should go with like dozens of millions of dollars probably. They will go to people who have hundreds of millions of dollars, and they promise to invest their money wisely. And of course, in the process, they will take like around 2 or 3% commission fees, and no matter what happens with that investment out there, they are taking their 2% at the end of the day and making probably like dozens of millions of dollars or just millions of dollars. So that is one way people who operate private equity are making so much money. And one of the companies, or the famous company that went bankrupt, is Toys R Us. So private equity saw that Toys R Us is struggling, so they raised money from investors, they purchased Toys R Us, then through the banks, they gave them billions of dollars in loans, and they kind of fixed Toys R Us for some time, and then they started selling it. But because it had so much debt at the end of the day that it couldn't actually invest in the online space, and when online shopping became the dominant thing in the market, Toys R Us could not compete with them and it went bankrupt. It's just one example. Of course, there's much more details to that, but that's usually what private equity does. I don't want to villainize what private equity does, but usually they're basically just trying to either make themselves rich, or best case scenario, they will get some good returns for their investors. And that company, I mean, nobody really cares what happens with that company. So, and that's not an option for most people. Most people can't go and build their private equity or be part of this because they simply don't have enough money. So there is another way to actually make money from or profit from this wealth transformation. And that is to pay attention to the shift in technology. Because whenever there is a shift in technology, wealth changes hands all the time. And the good example I can give you is probably Rockefeller. If you go back to the early 20th century, the wealthiest person in America was John Rockefeller. And if you adjust his net worth to inflation, it was over like $400 billion. So technically, it will make him twice wealthier than the richest person today, who is Elon Musk. But if you right now Google when he passed away, he passed his wealth to his kids. So his kids must have like hundreds of billions of dollars. But if you Google out their net worth, it's probably less than $10 billion. I can't be wrong with that, but it's most likely not more than $10 billion. Now, the natural question that comes into your mind is that what happened to those hundreds of billions of dollars? And the answer is very simple. It's not that somebody stole that money. It's just because he built his entire net worth in the oil industry, and that industry started becoming less significant by each consecutive year because technology sector became more important. Semiconductors became more important. So wealth basically simply shifted from one industry to another. So if the best way for you to profit or take advantage out of this wealth transformation is to simply be in the right industry that is evolving, that is taking over the world, because investors at the end of the day will take their money and will throw it into the new technology. Like, why would you stay in the oil industry when it's going down? You would rather invest in for example, in a renewable energy. So some of the industries that are reshaping the entire globe are electrical cars, AI, artificial intelligence, renewable energy, 5G, space, fintech, and crypto. Back in the days, banks were the dominant player when it came to sending money globally. But now we have players such as crypto. Now I can put hundreds of millions of dollars in a pen drive, and I can literally fly to a different country, and I move so much money. Back in the days, that was not an option. The only way for me to do that was go to JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or to any of those companies, and I had to pay high commissions, and then I had to go through multiple checkups. So you can see how wealth is moving. Those people who kept their money, for example, in all of those banks, suddenly took their money and now they threw it in crypto. Now, crypto isn't just about particular coins. Think of Coinbase or Binance. These are future JP Morgans. These are future Wells Fargo. They're already playing. Their valuation is probably much higher than a lot of these banks. And still, if you think about it, really, crypto is still in its early days. And in the next decade or so, these companies will overshadow and will overtake and will be the dominant players when it comes to the financial industry. So wealth changes hands in the banking industry from those traditional players into fintech and crypto. Think of Stripe, that is taking over the world and making online banking, not online banking, but online payments significantly easier for businesses. Electric cars shifted from Ford, GM, traditional businesses. Now the entire industry shifted outside the United States, and now China is the major player when it comes to electrical car and not the United States. I mean, just pull out the number, you'll see that China produces much more electrical cars than the United States, or probably like China produces if I can be wrong, but the numbers is probably like China produces half of the electrical cars that is produced annually in the world. So how do you take advantage out of it? Because most people can simply right now go and start a fintech company. They can't go and start an electrical car company and compete with Tesla. Most people are average people who have jobs, who have families. They don't have time for that. They're simply just living their lives. So how an average American, or not an American, how an average person today, wherever he lives in the world, can take advantage out of this transition? Now, if you're gonna build these technologies, of course, you will take the maximum advantage out of it. But if you're not, you still want to take part of it, right? And that's why, in order to understand that, most of those companies actually, so as we have discussed that wealth changes hands from one industry to another, from one company to another, right? And this change happens through something that we call the stock market. Because those companies at the end of the day don't randomly they have to raise money from somewhere, right? And the place they raise their money is the stock market. They go to the stock market, and first of all, they raise money from angel investors, from other investors, and then they go to the stock market, people buy and sell their stocks. What you have to understand is that every time that somebody actually buys a stock and then sells it for a higher price to someone else, you know what happened at this point? Wealth changed hands. Yes, it might be a few dollars, it might be a few $100, it might be a few $1,000. Nonetheless, what happened in this particular moment is that wealth changed hands. And most of the wealth transformation over the next decade or so, or maybe even shorter than that, is going to happen just like that, with small little pieces on everyday trades in the stock market. So for you to actually profit from it is that you have to go and start investing in the stock market. You have to learn how to do that. You have to buy or invest in companies that are going to dominate certain industries. So when wealth moves from one industry to another, and it's not just about one industry to another, you have to know which of those companies are going to succeed. So it's not just about some fancy names, but it's more about knowing the details, knowing the numbers, knowing how to do your analysis. Now, there are plenty of videos on the channel that can actually help you to get started, that will help you to have a basic idea about what the stock market is and how to start investing. Of course, this is not financial advice, but they will actually teach you about the basics of finance and the basics of financial statements. But for those people who want to actually really get deep into it and really master investing in the shortest period possible, then you can just go ahead and check the first link in the description. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.